Hi everyone, it's Eleanor. I'm coming from a bit of a different venue, as you can see. Stunning day here. It's a beautiful day to discover a new poet and discover that a book that kept itself really at an arm's distance from me finally started to bloom. And this, I think, is a testament to, what really good poetry does. Really good poetry sometimes takes a while to really get into. So I'm talking today about the book Cain Named the Animal by Shane McCrae. When I first started reading it, I realized immediately that here's a master poet. It's obvious. Also, this is not Shane McCrae's first rodeo, He's had several books previously, won several awards, teaches in Columbia. I never read his work before I'd heard of him. Fascinating what happened. The book is really divided into 3 segments. There's an introductory poem before the 3 segments called Some Heavens Are All Silence. Then there's the first section, Love Poems and Others. The second section only has 2 poems, recapitulations. And the third section is named Cain Named the Animal. Now, I immediately went to the third section because I thought, okay, I want to find out what's happening here. It's the title of the book. It's the title of the third section. Rookie mistake. To anyone who's picking up this book as a first experience of Shane McCrae, do yourself a favor, start with the first section. The second and third parts are, exactly what it says, recapitulations, and also what it says in the notes, which is most of the poems from that last third are supposed to be read as continuations of other poems and the Hell poem that can be found in his 2 previous work. In the Language of My Captor and The Gilded Auction Block are the 2 previous books that have been lauded that I haven't read. So if you haven't read them either, that's fine. Why did I not read them? Obviously because I'm a fool, but also because Shane McCrae was well known to be writing about really distressing racism that is happening in America, that he's experienced from his childhood trauma. I won't go into his biography, but it is crucial to understanding these poems, and it's just a quick Google and you'll see, I'll leave a link. And I was never in the mood for that, especially, during hard times, you don't always want to delve into the poems that are about the hard times. In any case, here I am, and I'm reading the first section, Love Poems and Others. And once I've come to terms with the fact that the rest of the book is a sequel for something that I can look up later, I can really enjoy these love poems. They are an absolute delight. And yes, there is still trauma. Of course there is, that's being discussed. But there's certainly a joyfulness and a glimmer of hope and light and much love in those poems. Once you've read Shane McCrae's work, you'll always know it immediately the minute you start reading one of his poems, even if his name isn't on it. He doesn't use punctuation. He uses a very, very effective repetition method that is at first frustrating because the repetition of a phrase or two here or there without the aid of punctuation forces the reader to go back and reread sections again and again, even after you've read the poem several times. Once you get used to it, it's fun in a sort of musical way. So stick with it if that's your issue. So what does he write about in this first section? Well, he writes about his love, really, for I believe his wife Melissa, his children, if I understand correctly, Sylvia and Nicholas. He names them. Sylvia, who has just turned 28. He writes 3 love poems in memory of a poet called Lucie Brock-Broido, who died in 2018. It's absolutely masterful the way he weaves her into these poems. And this brings me to a topic that maybe I've talked about before, I can't quite remember. What happens when when a poet is described as a poet's poet? What does that mean exactly? Well, I would say Shane McCrae, I would call him a poet's poet for many reasons to do with his technique, use of meter, use of syntax, etc. He's masterful, there's no doubt about it. He also, when he refers to Lucie, you really, if you're in the poetry world, if you're in the American poetry world, and you know a little bit, you will, make that connection. Now, I've never read Lucie Brock-Broido's poems, and I'm not, in that circle. But even though he does that, I don't feel excluded at all. I actually feel that he has introduced me to her and her poems. So now she's on my, on my TBR list, and she'll always be, to me, the poet whom I discovered via Shane McCrae, which is a lovely thing. So don't be put off by thinking that certain poets who make references to other poets are elitist. I really don't think so. It's just a lovely way of being introduced to someone new. He has several poems that refer once again, and this is an ongoing theme in all of his books from what I've read, to his life as a child, as an adolescent, growing up in terrible circumstances. He refers to his grandparents who kidnapped him, stole him from his black father, raised him to in a horribly torture-filled racist household. It's a very interesting combination, this section of poems, and I really loved it. Now, there's the weirdness. So what makes the weirdness the weirdness here, for me, I don't want to forget mentioning the dogs. The mention of the dogs. It's so entrancing in a really, well, not really entrancing. It's a bit creepy, actually, the way he discusses dogs in a way that you usually wouldn't. It's very surprising. And those, I think, probably are my favorite poems. He has a poem called The King of the Sadnesses of the Dogs. And again, it's not a poem that you can say exactly what it's about, but it's about so many things, and it's fantastic. Then he's got a poem called Husbands, which is absolutely amazing. And it's amazing because it's not quite clear to me precisely what he means by husbands, and precisely what he means by comparing a husband to this particular dog who, well, now that I think about it, maybe it is quite clear. The domesticated dog who suddenly shows his true colors by violently attacking a smaller animal or bird or some such. The discussion of such an occurrence with a domesticated pet in the context of a husband, just talking about it now is really, these images are exciting, the thoughtfulness, the philosophy behind it. I'm finding as I'm talking about the book now, that first third, the more excited I'm getting. Now, initially my favorite poem, it's still a favorite, but the dogs won me. There is a poem, let me find it for you, called The Butterflies, the Mountain and the Lake. He does something here that's so utterly divine. He embroiders together on the same canvas his relationship with his daughter and someone he calls his neighbor, which is in itself fantastic. Not a partner, not a fellow, not the mother, not the not a wife or partner. It's worth reading just for that poem, actually. It's a beautiful way of describing how having a child changes the course of your direction as a group, separately, and how that comes into play with your life from beginning to end, bringing the birth of the child and the death of the father. I'm probably spoiling the poem, but it's wonderful. In my Googling, because I wanted to see if it was published online so that I could link it for you, I couldn't find the original poem, but I found what was obviously an earlier draft. I can link to that. It's not half as good as the finished draft in this book, and it serves for a wonderful. I'll link it. Go and have a look, because if you do buy this book and you read the final version, you'll see the difference between an okay poem and a superb poem, and how a poet works on a draft to perfect it. It's fascinating. So, what else am I going to say here? Concerning the title is fascinating. Can I just say that I love the rhyme of the name Cain with Shane, and the hard C/K sound of Cain with McCrae. I love that. I don't know if it was just serendipity. Cain, named the animal, refers to the biblical story of Cain and of Adam in Genesis, in the book of Genesis, being told by God that he has the option of naming the animals, and what does that mean? And in the last poems, in the third section of the book, there's an exploration of the killing of Abel by Cain, what it means to name something, which is really what poetry is really all about, is naming things, and how that can be linked to death. And it's very interesting, but I would say it's hard going. I am certain that if you've read the two previous books, this would be a more successful grouping of poems, because from what I've read, Shane McCrae has created this world of hell and heaven, which is populated previously by political figures from the Trump era, from what I've heard, and is now continuing and may continue into the next books. So I'm still at the stage where I want to go back to that section and revisit that world, because it's really very mysterious still to me. There's a robot bird that speaks in quite humorous, colloquial language, giving orders to the speaker of the poem. And there's a lost tribe who are separate from Adam and Eve. And I think I'm going to have to move because the light is, I think I'm going to move now. Hang on, I'll stop over and come back. Okay, I need to quickly finish this off, but I have to say the most important thing. How did I suddenly flip though? I mean, I like the first poems, but how did I suddenly flip to thinking, okay, contender for new favorite poet? And I'll tell you why. I found my own personal key to what Shane McCrae's doing, I'm sure in his previous books, and definitely in this book. He's going back again and again to his childhood. And especially at the end of this book, there's a boy who climbs a wall to look at the stars and falls and hurts himself. There's a boy who goes into a tree, and that's how time starts. And at the end of the book, altogether, the very last stanza is about a boy and stars. And all of a sudden, I remembered the ending of the Ghibli movie by Miyazaki, which perhaps you're aware of, I'll leave a link, called Howl's Moving Castle, in which the young man who occasionally turns into a bird, which reminded me also of the robot bird in McCrae's poems, the young man had swallowed a star and had made a deal with Calcifer, that Calcifer was going to help him and he was going to give Calcifer his heart so that Calcifer could live. If you haven't seen the movie, sorry, it probably doesn't make sense, and spoiler alert, but in any case, it opened up the poems to me because I thought he's going back, McCrae that is going back again and again, and every time he goes back to his childhood, he heals himself more and more, just like in Howl's Moving Castle. And it's all about the stars. And the castle itself is incredible because there is a castle in McCrae's poems. And I'm not saying that McCrae saw the Ghibli movie and based it on that. Like, absolutely not. I'm certain he's probably never seen it. But for me, having that film with those motifs in my library of imagination has changed the way I see his poems and has opened them to me. In the first poem McCrae writes about Lucie Brock-Broido, the poet, he has her in a castle and he's visiting her in this castle, and she's giving him her book that she had written, the master letters. And I can't help thinking of the movie where the young man is helped towards being healed by a young woman who grows to be an old woman through magic, through a witch's spell. And if I remember correctly, she has very long gray hair, and Lucie Brock-Broido had very long straight blonde hair. Now, the book and the film are now intrinsically linked in my mind. And I'm explaining this to you because a good book of poetry will make room for each reader's personal library of imaginary motifs to perhaps take hold if it's appropriate. Not everything is given from the poet to the reader. The reader brings things to the poetry as well. And it's through doing that that I've had this really joyful moment. So I hope that makes sense to you in some way. I have had a wonderful time going back to the poems now. I've got to rush off. I have things to do. Remember, the only real property is the property of the mind, and I'll see you next time when I have 2 more books to discuss that are on the shortlist for the Fode Prize. Okay, bye-bye.